No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 3. The treacherous task of transporting treasure. With vast treasure in hand, the Spanish had secured their foothold in the New World. But now came a new challenge: transporting this wealth back to Seville's counting houses. The loot flowed in abundance, but the journey across the Atlantic was fraught with peril, perhaps more dangerous than the conquests themselves. In the early days of the Spanish Main, transport was haphazard, with individual ships or small, unprotected fleets setting sail when they pleased, each captain charting a course by whatever route that struck his fancy. But the Caribbean was a deceptively hostile sea. Its warm, cerulean waters might appear inviting, yet for Spanish captains it was a near impossible gauntlet to run. Unlike the easy southward currents that guided them through the Lesser Antilles to reach the New World, returning was quite a different ordeal. The northeasterly trade winds blew stubbornly against any eastward ship, steady at 15 to 25 knots, allowing little variation on the compass. Captains soon discovered the unforgiving geography and currents at play. The Greater and Lesser Antilles, with their volcanic peaks and coral reefs, formed a ring that seemed to trap the winds, turning the Caribbean into a basin of relentless currents that swept ever westward. For Spanish ships, leaving the Caribbean meant battling the trade winds and skirting islands strewn with reefs and shoals, hazards that seemed to emerge from nowhere, ready to rend hulls and dash hopes. In time, skilled Spanish mariners learned to turn these challenges to their advantage, understanding that they could catch the northward flow by hugging the coastline of Central America, then threading through the Yucatan Channel into the Gulf of Mexico. There, the Caribbean currents merged with runoff from the Mississippi, forming the mighty Gulf Stream, which swept them around Florida and up the North American coast before finally carrying them eastward across the Atlantic toward home. But these secrets came only through brutal experience. Captains first had to learn to navigate the maze of reefs, to avoid the sandbars that lurked in the shallow waters, and, worst of all, to survive the hurricane season, whose deadly storms left countless ships wrecked upon hidden shoals and reefs. Even when the elements relented, dangers remained ever present. The Spanish fleets were no sooner out of sight of the Caribbean than new threats closed in from the east: privateers and pirates. The lure of the New World treasure was irresistible to the French, English, and Dutch, who eagerly prowled the waters off the approaches to Europe. There, Spanish ships faced fast, well-armed raiders who had little to fear from the Spanish guns, often outnumbered and outmaneuvered by agile privateers who could cut a fat galleon from an unprotected convoy. Some of the boldest marauders even sailed south, lying in wait near the Canary Islands, ambushing outbound Spanish vessels already laden with silver, gold, and jewels. As the New World's bounty grew, the frequency of Spanish losses became intolerable. Hundreds of vessels disappeared each year. Spanish authorities knew they had to impose order on the chaotic treasure routes. By 1543, they launched an organized system, dispatching 2 major fleets per year to the Spanish Main. Each spring, a fleet of 30 or more ships departed Seville, bound for Veracruz, the end of the Mexican trade route that channeled gold and silver from the highlands down to the coast. This new Spanish fleet carried everything from wine to olive oil and glass, clothing, books, and utensils, all bound for the growing Spanish colonies. A cluster of warships escorted the flotilla, stationed at its edges to ward off privateers, though the dangers that lay ahead were never far from their minds. The second fleet, known as the Tierra Firma fleet, left Seville in August, arriving in the Caribbean late in the season after the hurricanes had passed. Its ships made port in Cartagena on the northern coast of South America, but the bulk of its merchantmen headed first for Nombre de Dios. This small harbor on the Isthmus of Panama was the primary treasure port where the wealth of the Inca, transported overland from the Pacific coast, awaited shipment. Laden with New World riches, the fleet made a stop in Cartagena for rest and repairs before embarking on the treacherous homeward journey through the Straits of Florida. Meanwhile, the Mexican fleet, after wintering in Veracruz, likewise departed for Havana in February, bearing the bounty of Mexico's mountains in its hold, awaiting the combined convoy for the long voyage home. The final leg of the treasure fleet's journey would see nearly 100 vessels, large and small, gathered in Havana's protected waters before venturing north. There, the combined fleet assembled like a lumbering beast, bristling with warships, guarding the king's treasure. Galleons carrying the royal fifth held the most precious cargo, each escorted by a complement of soldiers and bearing official seals, while merchantmen bore the profits of private interests, plantation crops, personal treasures, and the hoarded wealth of aristocrats who had carved out their fiefdoms in the New World. But despite the array of warships, the fleet was still a tempting target. Not every merchant vessel was designed for warfare. Many were aged hulks, barely seaworthy after years baking in tropical waters, their hulls weathered and worm-riddled. Their captains, often men of dubious skill and morals, had little choice but to follow the king's fleet, praying their cargo would reach Spain's shores intact. Adding to the ship's challenges, many of the ships only carried paltry defenses, a pair of rusty iron cannons lashed to the gunwales, with a scant supply of shot and powder, often spoiled by the humidity. Even in an age accustomed to cruelty, Spanish captains were infamous for their brutal treatment of the crew. Flogging and starvation were commonplace, and tales of mutiny, sabotage, and desertion ran rampant. One sailor, beaten mercilessly in Cartagena, slipped away to France, where he threw his lot in with a French corsair named Robert Bayal. Later, with his newfound allies, he led Bayal back to Cartagena, guiding the raiders to anchor undetected and slip overland past the fortifications. His thirst for revenge at last slaked. By the early 1550s, pirates had become the scourge of the Caribbean. Francois Leclerc, a French privateer with a wooden leg, led his fearsome fleet through the Spanish Main, earning the dreaded name Piede de Palo, or Peg Leg. His raids on small towns across Hispaniola and Puerto Rico left a trail of plundered settlements and broken spirits. But it was his brazen assault on Santiago de Cuba in 1554 that made him a legend, looting 80,000 pesos of treasure and casting terror throughout the region. Yet worse was to come. In 1556, another French corsair, Jacques de Sorez, descended upon Havana, leaving the city a desolate ruin, its wealth and pride reduced to ashes. When a second French squadron arrived just months later, they found nothing left worth stealing. The pirates, increasingly emboldened, no longer waited for Spanish ships to return to Europe, but sailed boldly into the Spanish Main itself. The open waters of the Caribbean, stretching over half again the size of the Mediterranean, were woefully unpoliced. Though the king did dispatch a few heavily armed warships to patrol the region, these vessels were scattered and scarce, and often did not coordinate with each other where and when they would be. They could hardly cover the vast territory, let alone protect the countless merchant ships sailing solo, bearing little defense against these marauders. By royal decree, every vessel sailing the Spanish Main was required to carry a minimum of 2 large brass cannon, 6 iron guns, and a sufficient stock of ammunition. But for most captains, each ton of weaponry meant 1 less ton of treasure or cargo, and more than a few ships left with barely enough powder to muster a single salvo. With such inadequate defenses, Spain's treasure fleets remained a moving target, prey for any privateer who dared to brave the tropical currents and blistering heat. As the years rolled on, the relentless pursuit of New World wealth drew Spain into a fierce cycle of ambition, wealth, and loss. The treasure fleets, for all their risks, continued to feed Spain's economy, sending silver and gold to fill the royal coffers and repay debts. Yet, each year the specter of loss loomed large. Wrecks littered the Bahamas' shallow waters, rotting ribs of ships swallowed by the shifting sands and hidden reefs. Squalls and tropical storms shattered flotillas, scattering survivors and silencing ships forever. But even as these dangers mounted, a new breed of raiders, as audacious as they were ruthless, loomed on the horizon. No longer content to lie in wait in European waters, these corsairs sailed into the Caribbean itself, navigating the same treacherous waters that the Spanish had learned to fear. And so began an era of high-stakes raids, daring sea battles, and harrowing escapes as the pirates of the Spanish Main set sail in pursuit of Spain's gilded armada, staking their lives on the chance to seize a slice of the New World's fabled riches. The Spanish Empire, secure in its vast domains, yet ever haunted by threat, could only steel itself for the trials to come, for the Spanish Main had become a theater of unending conflict, where fleets of treasure and ships of fortune clashed amid waves and wind, shaping a saga of gold, greed, and the enduring allure